On the cold streets of Chicago, Joe, a desperate beggar, begged for bread from a wealthy businessman but was refused. But ironically, when the businessman turned around, the beggar realized this businessman was the one who had driven him to the brink of death. Joe and his friend Carl, both homeless, were seated in a dark alley far from the bustling city. They shared a bottle of water while talking about the day that was drawing to a close. Joe, his voice heavy with thought, asked Carl if he believed in destiny. He wondered aloud if everything in life happened for a reason, even if they didn't understand why. Carl, a man of middle age with eyes that carried the weight of better days, gave a slight smile and said he believed more in luck, having learned to trust in it during their time on the streets. Joe couldn't shake the feeling that something greater might be guiding their steps. He felt that change was near, though he couldn't explain why. He shared his thoughts with Carl, sensing that they were on the verge of something significant. Carl looked up at the darkening sky, his face softening with hope. Maybe this time, Joe, things will be different. We've been through enough. It was clear from his words that he wished for a better future, something to lift them from the struggle they had known for so long. Joe couldn't help but smile faintly, the hope seeping into his heart. Carl stretched out a blanket he'd found earlier and handed it to Joe. The gesture was simple, but spoke volumes of their bond. The nights had been growing colder, and Carl's actions showed a quiet care for his friend's well-being. "It's not much, but it's something," Carl said with a reassuring smile. Joe accepted the warmth without a word, silently grateful for the comfort it brought. Reflecting on their earlier conversation, Joe made a decision. Tomorrow, he would ask for help, but not just from anyone. He felt the need to find someone who could truly understand, someone who could see beyond his current situation. There had to be someone who understood that their lives were shaped by fleeting moments, and that this was his moment to make a change. As dawn broke over the skyline, hunger gnawed at Joe, pushing him to act. He noticed a well-dressed man with his back turned, standing alone. Joe gathered his courage, his voice quiet but determined as he approached the man, asking for something as simple as a loaf of bread. The man, without turning around, responded coldly, refusing Joe's request. His voice was harsh and indifferent, offering no sympathy or recognition. Surprised by the bluntness, Joe felt his frustration growing, but he pressed on, explaining he wasn't asking for much, just a little help. "Please, just a loaf of bread." "I'm starving," Joe said, his voice desperate. The man remained silent for a moment, then finally spoke. "No, I can't help you. Try somewhere else." Finally, the man turned, and recognition struck them both. Joe froze as the sight of the man, Richard, brought a rush of anger and disbelief. "You, after everything," Joe muttered under his breath. Richard, now facing him, looked at Joe with contempt, remarking, "Joe, I never expected you to fall so low, resorting to begging. I should have known you'd end up like this." Joe, his anger rising, took a moment to collect himself before responding, his voice cold. "This isn't about charity, Richard. It's about humanity, something you clearly lost. You can turn me away today, but you can't escape the truth of our past." Richard, clearly irritated by the confrontation, turned to leave, throwing over his shoulder, "Enough, Joe. Your words mean nothing. Next time, choose who you beg from more wisely, or you'll just waste your time." Still shaken, Joe made his way back to the alley where Carl was waiting. The encounter had clearly affected him, and the weight of the moment showed on his face. Carl immediately noticed the change, and, concerned, asked what had happened. Joe sighed deeply and shared that he had run into Richard, the same man who had betrayed him and left him with nothing. When he had asked for help, Richard had rejected him without hesitation. Carl listened quietly before responding, acknowledging how difficult it was, but assuring Joe that he was right to keep pushing. Richard couldn't just get away with his actions. He then asked, "What's next?" Joe glanced upward, his mind still reeling. He spoke quietly about his next step. He planned to find Ellen, a former colleague who had become a lawyer. She was the one person who might understand and help him, and he knew he had to track her down. Carl nodded, his eyes full of determination, and reassured Joe that they would find her together. The next morning, the first light of day crept through the tall buildings surrounding the alley. The night had been restless for Joe, filled with thoughts of Richard and a burning desire for justice. Carl was already up, packing their few belongings with the efficiency of someone accustomed to life on the streets. Joe, filled with resolve, told Carl that today was the day they would find Ellen. He needed her to know what Richard had done, not just to him, but to everyone Richard had trampled to get ahead. Carl nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation, and said that Joe had a strength most people would have lost by now. As they made their way to the community center, Joe shared more about his past with Richard. He explained how he had trusted Richard, how they had built the company from nothing, and how, one day, he found himself locked out of everything, blamed for mistakes he didn't make. Richard had manipulated the evidence, turning Joe's life upside down. Carl, silent as he listened, only grew more determined to help. When they arrived at the community center, Joe's nerves began to surface. He wondered what if Ellen didn't remember him, or worse, couldn't or wouldn't help. His uncertainty was clear, but Carl reassured him with a simple reminder that he would never know unless he tried, and that Carl would be with him no matter what happened. Carl's calm words gave Joe the strength to continue. As they entered the community center, the bustling atmosphere stood in sharp contrast to the quiet streets outside. The center was alive with voices and movement, a beacon of hope for many like them. Joe's heart raced as they approached the information desk. He cleared his throat and, despite his nervousness, spoke with as much confidence as he could muster, explaining that they were looking for someone who used to work there. The woman at the desk listened, assessing the sincerity in Joe's request, and after a moment of thought, she nodded. If Ellen left any contact information when she moved on, it should be in our records, she said, her voice gentle but firm. As the woman sifted through the papers, the tension between Joe and Carl was palpable. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, with a nod, she found what she was looking for and wrote down a number on a scrap of paper, handing it to Joe. "Here's Ellen's contact information. I hope she can offer the help you need," she said with a reassuring smile. "I can tell this is very important. Good luck." Joe took the paper, his fingers trembling slightly as he held it, feeling a rush of gratitude. His voice, still shaky with emotion, conveyed the weight of the moment as he thanked the woman. "Thank you so much. This could really make all the difference for us," he said quietly. Before he could say anything else, Carl made a request of his own, asking if they could use the phone since they had no change or cell phone to make the call. "Actually, we need another favor," Carl added. "Could we use your phone? We don't have any change or a cell to make the call." The receptionist kindly agreed, handing over the phone. Joe dialed Ellen's number, and as soon as the call connected, her voice came through, warm yet authoritative, a tone that only a lawyer seemed to have. "Hello, this is the law office of Ellen Martins. How can I help you?" After Joe explained who he was and why it was so important, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Ellen finally spoke, her voice was full of recognition, her surprise giving way to concern. Joe Alvarez. Oh my God, it's been so long. How are you? What happened? How can I help?" Joe explained, his voice heavy with emotion, that his life had fallen apart after he left the company, and he had recently learned he wasn't the only one Richard had hurt. "Ellen, this is hard to explain over the phone, but it's about Richard," Joe said. "After I left the company, my life fell apart." And recently, I found out I wasn't the only one he hurt. He spoke quickly, struggling to convey everything he needed to say, sharing how he remembered Ellen's integrity, her unwavering sense of right and wrong. He explained how he desperately needed her help, how she had always been a beacon of truth when everything around them was crumbling. "I really need your help, Ellen. You were one of the few people who always stayed true, even when everything around us seemed to fall apart." Joe could feel his chest tighten as he listened to Ellen's response. She remembered him, his work ethic, and his dedication. She had her own suspicions about Richard, though she had never imagined things had escalated this far. "You've always been someone I respected. Don't worry. I'll help you with this. Let's meet soon, and we'll figure out the best way forward." The weight of her words, the reassurance that she was on his side, was enough to fuel the hope Joe had been clinging to. "Thank you, Ellen. This means more than you know," Joe said, his voice filled with relief. Ellen assured Joe that she would help no matter what, and urged him to set up an appointment so they could meet as soon as possible. She wanted every detail, every truth to come out so they could figure out the best way to proceed and bring justice to light. She promised Joe he wouldn't face this battle alone. He felt the weight of her words settle in his heart. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been wronged. After hanging up, Joe turned to Carl, his emotions a swirl of relief and hope. He shared with Carl what Ellen had said, almost unable to believe it himself. Carl, ever supportive, placed his hand on Joe's shoulder and reassured him that things were starting to shift in their favor. Carl believed that they were in this together, and that with Ellen's help, they could begin the fight for justice. Later that night, the two of them sat beneath the dim light of a street lamp in their usual alley, not holding any official documents, but instead the raw, painful memories that Joe had kept, locked away. Having lost everything, he held on to what he could, his memories, his truths, and hoped that they would be enough to convince Ellen of the extent of Richard's betrayal. Carl, listening intently, spoke of the many conversations they had shared, recalling the sabotaged projects, the false accusations Richard had made about Joe, the moments that proved Richard's true nature. He had no documents, but he had the truth. Joe shared his own determination, speaking with a fierce resolve. Those memories, those stories, were all he had left, and he would use them to expose Richard for who he really was, to show Ellen and the world the lies Richard had told. Carl understood the importance of Joe's words and reassured him once more that his truth was powerful. Richard couldn't erase it, and Ellen would hear it. Carl, standing by Joe through everything, promised to back him up, offering not only his words, but the strength of their friendship. Together, they would fight for Joe's story to be heard. The next day, as Joe and Carl walked to Ellen's office, Joe was filled with both nerves and a newfound courage. He could feel a glimmer of hope that things were finally starting to turn around. It was time to fight for real. With Ellen's help, he believed they had everything they needed to win. As he sat across from Ellen in her office, with Carl silently beside him, Joe knew the weight of the years of silence and betrayal was about to be lifted. As he spoke, unraveling the story of Richard's lies, Ellen listened intently, her face reflecting both empathy and barely contained anger. Richard had once seemed like a visionary, promising to take their partnership to great heights, but in reality, he had been undermining Joe all along, diverting funds, accumulating debts in Joe's name, and planning his escape. Ellen urged Joe to continue, her voice steady as she urged him to tell the full truth. Joe knew the weight of the moment, the gravity of the situation pressing on his chest. He hadn't talked about the betrayal in years, but Ellen's unwavering support made him find the courage. She had been there for him when the world had turned its back. She was ready to listen, and he needed to speak, even if his words felt like stones lodged in his throat. I know it's hard to talk about, Joe, but I'm here for you. I'd like to hear more about what Richard did to you. If you're ready, Ellen said gently, offering the space for him to open up. Joe took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his past pressing against him. The betrayal still felt fresh, like a wound that had never fully healed. Not only did he leave me financially destroyed, Ellen, but he ruined my reputation. He spread lies, accusations of fraud and incompetence, things that isolated me completely from everyone I once knew. He turned everything I worked for into dust. He left me fighting to understand how someone I trusted could betray me so deeply. I still don't understand it. His voice faltered, but Ellen's steady presence urged him on. Ellen, more than willing to help, didn't hesitate in her response. I'll need every document you have from that time, anything that could help expose Richard for what he is. With that, and your testimony, we can win this. We will take back J&R Motors. Joe paused, trying to steady the tremor in his voice, the lump in his throat. He had no evidence left. Everything had been taken from him in the chaos. I don't have the documents, Ellen. During the mess, I lost everything related to the company, but I know there are inconsistencies, witnesses who saw what Richard did. There are people who know I never did the things he accused me of. I believe that will be enough to start. Joe, Ellen's voice softened, but held firm. Your story, the pain and injustice you've suffered, is more than enough to get started. We'll track down every witness. We'll go through every public record available. Anything that can prove your innocence and Richard's guilt. This isn't just about winning a case. It's about bringing the truth into the light and making sure justice is done. I know the kind of person Richard is, and I know he won't stop until he's done as much harm as possible. Carl, who had been listening quietly, his loyalty to Joe unwavering, added his voice to the conversation. I've known Joe through thick and thin. I know a beggar's testimony doesn't mean much, but I'll be here to help him every step of the way. He's been there for me when no one else was. Joe looked at Carl, feeling not just the support of a friend, but the strength to face what was ahead. He turned to Ellen. Thank you, Ellen. With your help, I finally have hope. Not just for myself, but for everyone Richard has hurt. We're doing this together. His voice now held a new strength, the kind of strength that comes from knowing he wasn't alone in this fight. With Ellen's promise to pursue justice, Joe left her office feeling more determined than ever to confront the past and fight for his future. The road ahead would be long and full of challenges, but for the first time in years, he wouldn't face it alone. He knew he needed something more concrete to back up his case against Richard, though. He confided in Carl, who hadn't heard all the details of the betrayal Joe had endured. Carl, I need something solid to give Ellen. There's a place where Richard and I used to keep important company records. Maybe there's still something there I can use. Carl frowned, concern furrowing his brow. But Joe, how are you going to get in? What if it's dangerous? Joe's eyes hardened with resolve. I know a way in. After everything I've been through, I've got nothing left to lose. But the truth needs to come out, Carl. It's not just about me. It's about everyone Richard has hurt. We need to make sure he pays for what he's done. The determination on Joe's face shone bright under the pale light of the moon. Carl nodded, understanding the urgency in Joe's words. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about righting a wrong that had torn their lives apart. Carl assured Joe that if he decided to go through with this, he wouldn't be facing it alone. They were a team now, and Carl wasn't about to let him handle it by himself. As they walked under the moonlit sky, heading towards the factory, once a place full of dreams for Joe, now shrouded in shadows and secrets, Joe couldn't help but recall how familiar this place once was. Now, it felt like a labyrinth of deception. Inside, the atmosphere seemed to suffocate them, thick with betrayal. As they searched through the office, hoping to find something that might reveal Richard's wrongdoings, Joe spoke quietly. telling Carl more about the depth of the betrayal he had suffered. He explained how Richard had known he trusted him, and how Richard had exploited that trust to weave a web of lies, diverting funds and framing Joe as the scapegoat. Richard had believed he had destroyed Joe, but Joe knew better. His voice was heavy with both anger and a quiet, simmering strength as he recounted the dark manipulation that had twisted his life. Moved by his friend's pain, Carl helped him search every corner of the room until they found something. A set of hidden documents that could prove Richard's financial manipulation. Carl's voice cracked with excitement as he handed the papers to Joe, confirming what Joe had suspected all along. This was the evidence they needed to take Richard down. Joe, holding the documents in his hands, felt a surge of relief and vindication wash over him. With Ellen's help, they could finally clear his name and seek justice for all the people Richard had harmed. Leaving the factory, both men knew the battle was far from over. But with the evidence in hand and their cause clear, they were ready to face whatever challenges awaited them. Joe felt a new sense of purpose. He was no longer afraid. The need to confront Richard, the man who had caused him so much pain, was stronger than any fear. "Carl, it's time," Joe said, his voice unwavering with determination. "I can't let Richard get away with this. He needs to know I know the truth, and I'm ready to fight for it." Carl looked at Joe, understanding the fire in his friend's eyes. "I get it, Joe. But we need to be smart about this. We can't risk everything now, not when we're so close to justice. Maybe we should talk to Ellen before we do anything rash," Carl suggested, cautious about the consequences of a direct confrontation. Joe knew Carl was right. "You're right, Carl. Let's talk to Ellen. She'll know what to do." He understood the importance of acting with care. They couldn't afford to make a mistake now. When they arrived at Ellen's office, she greeted them with a serious expression, already sensing the gravity of the situation. Joe quickly explained his need to confront Richard and the reasons behind it. "Ellen, I feel like I have to do this. I need Richard to know I'm not his victim anymore," Joe said, his voice full of urgency and conviction. Ellen listened carefully, weighing the risks of such an action. After a thoughtful pause, she spoke with a calm, measured tone. "Joe, I understand your anger, and I see why you want to confront him, but we need to think this through. This isn't just about confronting him. It's about making sure we win this fight." Confronting Richard directly could put Joe and Carl in a risky position, so Ellen advised them to stick to the legal route. She suggested they should use the evidence they had gathered so far and focus on presenting their case properly, emphasizing that they could still make sure Richard would face the consequences of his actions, but they had to do it the right way. Joe, after listening to her calm and rational words, took a moment to reflect. He realized that her caution was born from experience and wisdom. Joe expressed his trust in Ellen, telling her that if she believed this approach was the best, he would follow her guidance. His voice wavered with emotion as he asked for her help in making sure Richard would be held accountable for everything he had done. Ellen reassured him, promising that together they would fight for justice. She told him that his story would be heard and that Richard would have to answer for his crimes. After the meeting, Joe and Carl decided to take a walk through the peaceful streets of Chicago. They needed time to clear their minds and talk about their next steps. While walking, they discussed their strategy for the case, but Joe's thoughts were interrupted when he saw a familiar figure approaching. His heart raced as he recognized Richard confidently walking toward them. Before Joe had a chance to avoid him or change direction, Richard spotted them. With a grin that barely concealed his smugness, Richard approached, eyes locked on Joe. He greeted him with a sneer, commenting on the unfortunate place Joe had ended up and mentioning he had seen the cameras catch Joe's visits to their old factory. He even hinted that Joe's actions could be considered an invasion of private property, suggesting that trouble could be on the horizon. Joe, though surprised, didn't let fear take over. He stood tall, facing Richard without flinching. He calmly replied that Richard could try to intimidate him, but it wouldn't work this time. Joe made it clear that he was after justice, and with the help of a strong lawyer like Ellen, he wouldn't stop until the truth was revealed. Carl, standing next to Joe, spoke up, backing him up. He reminded Richard that Joe wasn't facing this battle alone, and that there were people who knew the truth about what Richard had done. They weren't going to let him get away with it. Richard let out a bitter laugh and dismissed the idea that a lawyer could help them. He scoffed at the mention of Ellen, mocking her as a former employee of J&R Motors. He belittled Joe and Carl, saying they were pathetic and couldn't possibly think they stood a chance against him. With a mocking tone, he warned them to be careful, hinting that it would be a shame if the police got involved in the so-called invasion. Joe's anger flared, but he remained calm. He told Richard that no matter what threats he made, they had nothing to hide. They stood by the truth, something Richard could never claim. He reminded Richard that the truth always comes to light, eventually. Richard eyed Joe one last time, sizing him up before turning to walk away. He muttered that they would see who would prevail in the end, leaving a chilling promise hanging in the air. As Richard walked away, Joe felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The unexpected encounter had been charged with tension, yet it only strengthened his resolve to fight against the wrongs Richard had committed. Joe turned to Carl, his voice steady but laced with determination. They had to be more careful now. Richard wasn't going to play fair, but with Ellen on their side, they had a real shot at winning this fight. Joe knew the battles ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was prepared to face them. The morning after the tense encounter with Richard, Joe woke with a gnawing sense of restlessness. He knew Richard wouldn't let the meeting slide without retaliation. He turned to Carl and suggested they meet with Ellen before Richard could make his next move. Carl agreed, and the two made their way to Ellen's office. As they recounted the events of the previous day, Ellen listened intently, but her expression wasn't one of surprise. It was disappointment, tinged with frustration. She had expected something like this. Early that morning, a summons had arrived at the office, accusing them of trespassing and damaging Richard's property. Joe's heart sank as Ellen explained the situation. He couldn't believe it. This was exactly what Richard had been waiting for. A chance to discredit them. Joe's frustration bubbled to the surface. The security footage should have proven their innocence. Richard was clearly manipulating the evidence. Ellen sighed, running a hand through her hair in exasperation. "This complicates everything," she said, the weight of the situation pressing down on them all. "Now, not only do we have to prove Joe's innocence on the original charges, but we also have to fight these new accusations of trespassing." You two gave Richard exactly what he wanted, a way to undermine you. As they absorbed the gravity of their situation, Ellen began to outline a new plan of action, one that would redirect attention back to Richard's illegal activities. Joe and Carl listened carefully, knowing they had to act with even more caution now. Ellen emphasized the importance of not making any moves without consulting her first. She would work to discredit the evidence Richard had presented and continue gathering legitimate proof of his fraud. With the strategy in place, Joe and Carl nodded in agreement. They understood the risks they were facing and the difficult road ahead, but their desire for justice, for clearing Joe's name, had not waned. The office, which had initially been a place of uncertainty, quickly became their operations hub. Ellen, Joe, and Carl gathered around a table littered with documents, photos, and notes. Ellen's focus was sharp as she began mapping out her strategy to dismantle Richard's claims and bolster their defense. "First thing we need to do," Ellen said, her voice calm but firm, "is challenge the authenticity of the security footage. I'll reach out to a video expert to examine the tapes. If we can prove they've been tampered with, the trespassing charges will fall apart." Her determination was evident as she explained her approach. Joe, still feeling guilty for complicating things, expressed his gratitude to Ellen. He knew they were on the right path, but the weight of their situation was heavy. Yet in that moment, with Ellen's guidance, Joe felt a renewed sense of hope. The truth was on their side, and with every step forward, they grew closer to justice. Ellen listened intently as Joe expressed his gratitude. His words were filled with a mixture of relief and frustration, unsure how to properly convey his thanks. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you're doing," Joe said, his voice thick with emotion. Ellen, her gaze both understanding and firm, met his eyes. "Joe, what's done is done," she replied, her tone steady but filled with conviction. "Now, we need to move forward, together. We have to keep pushing for the truth, and we need more than just the recordings to bring Richard down. Do either of you have a contact who can testify about his actions at J&R Motors?" Carl, eager to contribute, leaned forward. "Actually, I know someone who works security at the plant. He always struck me as trustworthy. Maybe he knows something about those recordings, or maybe he saw something else Richard did." Ellen nodded with a spark of optimism. "That could be extremely helpful, Carl. Get in touch with him and see if he's willing to assist us. We need all the support we can get." She made a note, adding this new lead to her growing list of strategies. Turning her attention back to Joe and Carl, Ellen continued with renewed determination. "I'll also prepare a detailed statement outlining our findings. We'll make it clear that the accusations against Joe are baseless, and we'll take all the necessary legal steps to make sure everyone knows it. This will force Richard into a defensive position, giving us a moral upper hand." Both Joe and Carl exchanged a glance, a shared understanding in their eyes. Despite the daunting legal battle ahead, a new wave of hope and determination surged within them. Joe, now with a renewed sense of purpose, spoke up, his voice steady. "We're going to make this happen. Richard thinks he can intimidate us, but he's about to learn that we're stronger than ever. With the truth on our side, we're going to flip this whole thing around." Ellen smiled, the corner of her lips lifting with quiet pride. The group was united, and their resolve had only strengthened. Together, they began preparing for their next steps, knowing the coming days would be critical. The atmosphere in Ellen's office was thick with focus, but there was also a cautious optimism hanging in the air. They had the tools to fight. It was just a matter of executing their plan. "I've been thinking," Ellen began, as she carefully examined the papers on her desk. "If we can discredit the security footage that Richard's using against you, it won't just undermine the invasion charges. It'll call his entire credibility into question. That could be the game changer we need in court." Joe, sitting across from her, nodded in agreement. A wave of gratitude swept over him as he looked at Ellen. "Ellen, your clarity on this is exactly what we needed. I don't know where we'd be without you. Thank you, really." Carl, ever the loyal supporter, added with a grin, "And don't forget, we have the truth on our side. Richard may try to manipulate the situation, but in the end, the truth always wins. We're in this together, Joe." Ellen gave a brief, encouraging smile before her focus returned to the papers in front of her. "Now, more than ever, we need to stay focused and keep pushing forward. Joe, you and Carl should continue gathering any additional information that could strengthen our case. Meanwhile, I'll start preparing the paperwork to challenge the recordings and organize a press conference. We'll get the word out. Let's make sure the public knows what Richard is trying to do." With their plan now clear, Joe, Carl, and Ellen felt more united than ever. They knew the road ahead would be tough, but they also knew they had the truth and each other on their side. The fight for justice had only just begun. Ellen's plan was simple yet powerful: take their story to the public and shift the narrative in their favor. For Joe, Hearing her strategy felt like a breath of fresh air. The possibility of finally clearing his name and exposing Richard for the fraud filled him with an overwhelming resolve. It was time, he thought, time to show everyone who Richard really was. He felt ready to do whatever it took. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the skyline of Chicago, the trio continued their work. Each of them focused on their individual tasks, but they were bound by a common goal: justice. But as the days passed, obstacles began to emerge, testing their resilience and commitment to the cause. The optimism they had once held and their carefully laid plans started to crumble as unforeseen complications arose. Ellen, after a call that morning, brought the bad news. "The video expert you hired, he said the footage was remotely deleted before he could analyze it properly. We've lost our key evidence to discredit Richard's accusations." Joe's voice carried frustration. "Without that footage, we can't prove the invasion charges are false. This is a major setback." Sitting behind her cluttered desk, Ellen buried her face in her hands, trying to process the news. "This is a heavy blow. Without those recordings, it's going to be much harder to prove our case. But we can't give up now. We have to find another way to weaken Richard's case." Carl, who had been listening quietly, spoke up for the first time. "It's not just that. Remember the contact I mentioned, the one who worked in security? He's backing out. It looks like someone's threatened him or scared him into silence." The setbacks left them feeling vulnerable. The once promising strategy now seemed fragile, rattled by outside forces and Richard's manipulation. "We're up against more than just Richard's cunning," Ellen said, trying to instill some hope in the group. "There are forces at play in the shadows, ensuring he gets away with this. But we can't stop now. We need to be smarter, more resilient." Joe, although discouraged, recognized the truth in Ellen's words. Richard had always been able to manipulate the situation to his advantage, but now, more than ever, they had to stand together, not just for Joe, but for everyone Richard had wronged. The group spent the rest of the day refining their strategy, looking for loopholes and alternatives to strengthen their case. Each setback, while disheartening, only reinforced their resolve to seek justice. They knew the road ahead would be even more challenging, but they were determined to press on, no matter the obstacles. After a long, tiring day of planning, Joe and Carl decided to take a walk around the old J&R Motors factory. For Joe, it was a place heavy with memories of the past. As they strolled, engrossed in their discussion about the case, Joe suddenly heard a familiar voice. It was Mary. She had been a part of the original team at J&R Motors, working closely with Joe on various projects before Richard had taken control. Surprised and relieved to see a friendly face, Joe responded warmly, "Mary, I can't believe it's really you. How have you been?" The encounter with Mary offered Joe not only a moment of comfort, but a potential turning point in their battle for justice. Mary's face was a mixture of concern and resolve as she spoke, her voice steady despite the weight of the situation. She had been following the developments closely and knew the difficulties Joe had been facing with J&R Motors. She understood how much Ricardo had wronged him, but Mary was uncertain how she could help. When she saw both Joe and Carl together, she knew this was the moment to make things right. Carl, watching the exchange unfold, recognized the significance of this reunion. "Do you know anything that could help us take down Ricardo?" he asked, his voice filled with hope. Mary nodded, her expression serious. "Yes, I saw a lot while I was there. Ricardo was always ambitious, but I saw him cross the line several times. Fake documents, secret meetings, things that shouldn't have been happening. I didn't say anything at the time because I was scared," she admitted, her voice tinged with regret. "But seeing what Joe's going through, I want to help." Joe, overwhelmed with emotion, felt a surge of gratitude. He knew how valuable Mary's testimony could be. "Mary, your help means everything. This could be the key to exposing Ricardo for the fraud he is." Determined to act quickly, Joe immediately called Ellen, explaining the unexpected encounter with Mary and her willingness to assist. Ellen, recognizing the potential impact of this turn of events, called for an urgent meeting at her office. "Mary, your bravery in stepping forward could change the course of this case. We're going to make sure your story is heard and justice is served," Ellen reassured them as they gathered in her office. The following morning, however, a sense of dread settled over the group when they realized Mary was missing. Her absence cast a shadow over everything they had worked for. The silence was suffocating, and Joe was the first to break it. "Ellen, she wouldn't just disappear. Something's happened to her," he said, his concern palpable. Ellen, still holding the phone after another failed attempt to reach Mary, nodded gravely. "I'm calling the police right now. This isn't just someone being late. We need all the help we can get to find her," she said, her voice resolute. Carl, standing beside Joe, thought for a moment before speaking. "What if we talk to people who live near her? Maybe someone's seen something. I can go." "Good idea, Carl. Any lead could be crucial at this point," Ellen said, as she ended the call with the authorities. "Joe, you should stay here. If Mary contacts us, she'll need a familiar face." The news soon came that Mary's car had been found. The discovery left Joe shaken, but Ellen's words pulled him back to reality. "We can't waste time. If Ricardo is behind this, he's just made a huge mistake. We'll turn this against him," she said, with a controlled fury. Joe's mind raced as he looked at Ellen and Carl. Ricardo will pay for this, for what he's done to Mary, for everything. The determination in the office was thick, everyone feeling the weight of the situation. That night, under a starlit sky that contrasted with the tension in the air, Joe, Carl, and Ellen prepared for one of the most dangerous missions they had undertaken in their fight against Ricardo. New information had led them to a remote location, a place where they believed Mary was being held. They knew this could be their last chance to make things right. They approached the abandoned building, its weathered walls casting a shadow of desolation over the darkened street. Carl, standing a few steps behind Joe, whispered, his eyes scanning the crumbling structure. "Are you sure this is the place?" he asked, his voice tense. "It's the location the anonymous tip gave us," Ellen replied, her voice calm but firm. She checked the address on her phone once more. "And the clues we found in Mary's car lead us here. We need to be quick and quiet." Joe's heart raced in his chest, a sense of guilt tightening around him. "This is all my fault," he thought, the weight of Mary's peril pressing down on him. He felt responsible for her being in this dangerous position. "I should be the only one to go in." Ellen noticed the turmoil on Joe's face. She stepped closer, resting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Her gaze met his, steady and unwavering. "Joe, we're in this together," she said softly. "We all have a role to play. Mary is our friend too. We won't let Richard win." With their plan in place, they divided into two groups. Carl stayed on lookout, while Joe and Ellen crept through the shadows, entering the building. The interior was cold, the air thick with decay. Every step echoed through the empty hallways, amplifying the tension and the growing sense of danger. They moved cautiously, searching every room, until a muffled noise caught their attention. It came from behind one of the closed doors. Joe gestured to Ellen, signaling for silence, before pushing the door open with her help. Inside, bound and visibly shaken, was Mary. Tears ran down her face as she recognized her rescuers. Ellen quickly moved to her side, checking to make sure she was physically unharmed, while Joe sent a signal to Carl. The rescue had gone smoothly, but they knew their fight wasn't over. With Mary safe, they now had more than just a chance to take down Richard. They had a living witness to his wrongdoings. As they left the building, the moonlight illuminated their path, a quiet reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always a glimmer of hope. The trial was moved up, and everyone braced for the day of reckoning that would bring justice to Joe and his friends. The morning of the trial, the courtroom was packed with spectators, the air thick with anticipation as Joe and his team entered. Whispers rippled through the crowd at their arrival. Mary, though still recovering from the trauma, stood strong beside Joe, ready to face Richard and tell her story. Ellen gave Joe an encouraging look. "We're all here for you, Joe. Today, the truth will come out." "Thank you, Ellen," Joe replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how I would have made it this far without you." He turned to Mary. "And you, Mary, your courage today will make all the difference. We're in this together." Mary nodded, her resolve hardening. It's time to put Richard in his place. He can't get away with everything he's done. As the trial unfolded, Mary's testimony about Richard's corrupt practices at J&R Motors left the courtroom in stunned silence. "I saw it with my own eyes," she said, locking eyes with the judge. "Richard forged documents, manipulated the numbers. He never thought he'd get caught." Joe, too, took the stand, sharing the pain and betrayal he had endured. "I trusted him. We were partners, friends. But he used me, ruined my life, all for power and money." His voice quivered with emotion as he recalled the depth of his betrayal. With the truth now out in the open, it was clear that Richard's manipulation could no longer hide behind his lies. The walls of his deceit were crumbling, and justice was within reach. Joe's voice was thick with a blend of sorrow and resolve as he spoke about Richard's betrayal. He had trusted Richard once, built a life together, but all Richard had ever cared about was power and money, to the point where he destroyed Joe's world. The weight of those words lingered in the air like a heavy fog. When Richard attempted to undermine both Joe and Mary by presenting forged documents, the confrontation became inevitable. Richard, with shaky confidence, stood his ground. He insisted that the documents were proof of his innocence and claimed the accusations against him were based on lies. But Ellen, unshaken, wasted no time in retorting, her voice steady and sharp. She immediately demanded a thorough investigation into the authenticity of those documents, calling out the manipulation in the courtroom. The judge, understanding the gravity of the situation, agreed to Ellen's request. The tension in the room was unbearable as they waited for the results. Then, the truth came crashing down. The documents were proven to be fake. It was a crushing blow to Richard's defense, and Ellen's words were clear and decisive. "This is clear evidence of Mr. Richard's deception. I ask that these findings be taken into account as you make your decision in this case." The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Richard was found guilty, and Joe, along with his team, felt a deep sense of relief, a long-awaited taste of justice that had seemed so out of reach. As they left the courtroom, Joe paused, looking at his friends. "We did it. We got justice, and it's all thanks to you. Thank you for never giving up on me," he said, his voice full of gratitude. Carl, placing a hand on Joe's shoulder, responded, "Joe, we always knew the truth. Standing by your side was the easiest and right thing to do." Ellen smiled warmly. "Today, justice prevailed. But remember, Joe, this isn't just your victory. It's for everyone who seeks justice." As the sun began to set behind them, the group shared a moment of camaraderie and relief. The battle had been fierce, but together they had faced it head-on and emerged victorious. 2 years later, J&R Motors, under Joe's leadership, had risen again, with Carl running operations, Mary leading product development, and Ellen providing legal counsel. They gathered at the company, celebrating its ongoing success. Joe looked around at his companions, his heart full. "Without you, none of this would have been possible," he said, his eyes reflecting deep appreciation. Carl smiled, joking, "And to think we started out as just a small group, determined to see justice done." Mary added, "We turned a dream into reality, overcoming every obstacle together." Ellen, raising a glass, proposed a toast to a bright future for J&R Motors, where integrity and innovation would always go hand in hand. Far from their celebration, Richard was facing the consequences of his actions, serving time in prison for his fraudulent deeds. Meanwhile, the group took a moment to reflect on their journey, grateful for the path they had walked together. They were stronger than ever, united in their success. The future for J&R Motors looked promising, and with each passing day, their company continued to grow into one of the leading motor manufacturers in the United States.